The doctor's ad in the Laramie Gazette read 11 words. Widower physician seeks capable housekeeper. Wages fair. No references required. Clara Voss read it twice. Standing in the cold outside the post office in Cheyenne, the wind pulling at her coat, she had $12.40 in her boot. She had a trunk with a broken latch and a dress that still smelled faintly of the house fire that had taken everything else. She had no references because everyone who might have written one was either dead or had decided her uncle's word carried more weight than hers. She folded the newspaper and walked to the telegraph office. She did not tell the telegraph operator her real name. She signed the reply C. Voss, available immediately, and paid for the wire with coins she counted out on the counter one by one. 3 days later, she was on a train heading north. The town of Ridge Creek, Wyoming, sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of pale limestone, the kind of place that looked like it had been dropped there by accident and never quite figured out how to leave. It had a general store, a feed barn, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that was open more reliably than the church, and a 2-story house on the eastern edge of town where Dr. Edmund Hale had lived and practiced medicine for 11 years. Clara arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, stepping off the stage with her trunk and a carpet bag, and the particular stillness of a woman who had already decided she would not be turned away. Edmund Hale was waiting on the porch. He was taller than she had imagined from the terseness of the ad. A lean, angular man somewhere past 40, with gray beginning to show at his temples and the kind of stillness about him that came not from ease but from long practice of keeping himself in check. He looked at her the way men in his position often did, measuring, skeptical, already calculating how much trouble she might be. She met his eyes and said nothing. He said, "You're younger than I expected." "You're older," she said. There was a silence. Then he stepped back and held the door open. The house was clean but cheerless. That was the first thing Clara noticed. The floors had been swept and the windows were free of grime, but there were no curtains, and the kitchen had the organized blankness of a place maintained by habit rather than care. Someone had been cooking meals and washing dishes and keeping the wood stacked, but no one had been living there in any real sense for some time. The second thing she noticed was the girl. She was perhaps 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a reader open in front of her and an expression of intense suspicion fixed on Clara. Her name, Edmund told her, was Nora. She did not shake hands. She did not smile. She looked at Clara the way Clara had once looked at a closed door she wasn't sure she should open. "She doesn't warm up quickly," Edmund said. "Neither do I," Clara said. She set her trunk in the small room off the kitchen, the housekeeper's room, wallpapered in faded blue, and she unpacked her things in 15 minutes because there was not much to unpack. Then she put on her apron and started on supper. The work was not difficult. It was simply constant. Edmund kept long hours, out before dawn, to see to the Ketterly family's sick cattle dog, which was not precisely a physician's concern, but which he had seen to anyway, back before breakfast, gone again by 8 to the Mendez homestead 2 miles east, where the eldest son had a fever that had not broken in 4 days. Clara made meals and kept the house, and managed the supply cabinet that Edmund used for his medical work, cataloging bottles and bandages with the same methodical attention she had once given to her father's accounts. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers. It was, in the end, what had gotten her into trouble. Her uncle's name was Gerald Voss. He had been her father's brother and the executor of her father's estate, and for 3 years after her father's death, he had been methodically transferring that estate into his own name, using documents that Clara had eventually understood were forged. She had brought this to the attention of the county clerk in Cheyenne. The county clerk had been a friend of Gerald's. 2 weeks later, the house she was renting had caught fire. The origin of the fire was never determined. She had not told Edmund Hale any of this. She was not sure yet whether she would. Nora came around slowly, the way children do when they are being watched too carefully, not with sudden warmth, but with a gradual relaxation of the careful distance she had maintained. By the end of the second week, she was showing Clara things. A bird's nest she had found behind the barn, a rock that she said looked like a horse's head, a story she had been writing in a composition book with a green cover. "You can read it if you want," Nora said, not looking at her. "I'd like that," Clara said. The story was about a girl who lived in a tower and had figured out how to climb down by herself. It was 6 pages long, and the spelling was occasionally ambitious. Clara read it twice and told Nora it was the best thing she had read in some time, which was true. Nora took the book back and said nothing, but she sat closer to Clara at supper. That evening Edmund noticed. He said nothing about it, but Clara caught him watching Nora with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between relief and a grief he hadn't finished with yet. His wife had died 2 years ago. Fever, same as the Mendez boy, though the Mendez boy had eventually recovered and Edmund's wife had not. Clara had pieced this together from things Nora said and a photograph on the parlor shelf, and the way Edmund sometimes went still in the middle of a sentence, as if he'd walked into a room and forgotten why. She found the financial ledgers by accident, 3 weeks in, while looking for extra candles in the cabinet under the stairs. She was not snooping. She had simply pulled open the wrong door and found a wooden box with a broken clasp, and inside it a ledger, a folder of correspondence, and a bill of sale she did not immediately understand. She put it back and went to make breakfast. But that evening, after Nora was in bed and Edmund was in his study, she knocked on the study door and said, "I wasn't looking for it, but I found your ledger under the stairs." He looked up from the papers on his desk. "I think you should know," she said, "that the numbers in it are wrong." There was a long quiet. Then he said, "I know." She waited. "I borrowed against the practice 3 years ago," he said. "My wife was sick for a long time before she died. I owe the bank in Laramie $4,200. I have been unable to make the last 2 payments." He said it the way a man says a thing he has said many times to himself alone, flat, without inflection, because inflection would cost him something he couldn't afford. "I placed the advertisement because I could no longer afford a full-time nurse for Nora. A housekeeper at lower wages was the only practical adjustment remaining." Clara looked at him for a moment. "May I see the ledger?" she said. She worked through the numbers over 3 evenings at the kitchen table after supper, with a candle and a pencil and a patience she had inherited from her father, who had once told her that every problem that could be written down could be worked through. Edmund did not look over her shoulder. He brought her coffee once and set it at the edge of the table, and went back to his study, which she understood to be his version of permission. What she found was not good, but it was not as bad as Edmund believed. The loan carried an interest rate that had been applied incorrectly, compounded in a way that was not consistent with the terms of the original note. She had seen this before. Not an accident, she suspected. Banks in small territories sometimes relied on borrowers not reading the fine print carefully enough, or not being able to dispute it if they did. She also found that Edmund had been underbilling, not from generosity, though she suspected that was part of it, but from a habit of estimating low and not following up. He had delivered the Ketterly twins in January and billed for 1 visit. He had attended to 3 broken bones across 2 families between March and May, and had written a single entry in the ledger that she could only interpret as him having forgotten to come back and finish the accounting. She wrote out a clean version and left it on the kitchen table before she went to bed. Edmund read it in the morning. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father kept accounts," she said. "I kept them with him starting when I was 9. "Who was your father?" She paused only briefly. "Henry Voss," she said. "He had a hardware business in Cheyenne. He died 4 years ago." Edmund looked at the papers in his hand. "This still leaves the principal. I know. I can't make back $4,000 by correcting my billing records." "No," she said. "But it's a better position than you think you're in, which changes what your options are." He looked at her then, not the assessing look from the first day, but something closer and less guarded. She did not look away. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, and she saw no reason to obscure it, "I'm not very good at leaving things wrong when I can see how to fix them." The man's name was Douglas Crane, and he arrived in Ridge Creek on a Wednesday in September, riding a good horse and wearing a suit that had not been bought in Wyoming. He went to the bank first, and then to Edmund's house, and he introduced himself as a representative of the Laramie Lending Consortium, with what he clearly believed was a disarming smile. Clara answered the door. He told her he was there to see Dr. Hale on a matter of business. She told him Dr. Hale was with a patient and he was welcome to wait in the parlor. She did not offer him coffee. She stood in the kitchen doorway, where she could hear without being seen, and she listened. Douglas Crane explained to Edmund, when he came in 20 minutes later, that the consortium was willing to accelerate the payment schedule on the existing loan. This was a courtesy, he said. Given the doctor's payment history, the consortium wanted to work with him. He used the word generosity twice. He offered Edmund a renegotiated note that would consolidate the existing debt and a further line of credit for operational improvements. He placed the document on the parlor table and uncapped his pen. Edmund had not reached for the pen. Clara came to the doorway. "I'm the doctor's housekeeper," she said. "May I look at the document?" Douglas Crane looked at her. "This is a private business matter." "Then we'll treat it privately," she said. "If you'll give me a moment with the papers." What Douglas Crane was offering Edmund was, at its core, a second trap set over the first one. The new note absorbed the corrected principal, which was somewhat lower than the original claim, she noticed, suggesting someone had already anticipated a challenge to the interest calculation. But the new terms extended the repayment period over 15 years at a rate that would ultimately cost Edmund 3 times the original amount. The operational credit line had a separate clause that allowed the consortium to take the practice and the house as collateral in the event of any default, including a default triggered by Edmund's death or incapacity. A doctor, treating sick people in a dangerous country, signing a note that would transfer his house and livelihood to a lending institution if he fell ill or was injured. She set the document down. "The collateral clause on page 4, she said. "The incapacity provision, will you explain what that covers?" Douglas Crane smiled with his teeth. "Standard language, protective for both parties. If Dr. Hale is thrown from a horse and breaks his leg," she said, and is unable to see patients for 6 weeks, is that incapacity under this provision?" A short pause. "Temporary incapacity would typically, yes or no?" Edmund was watching her. Douglas Crane said, "The consortium has always worked with borrowers to find reasonable." "That's a yes," she said. "Thank you." She turned to Edmund. "I'd like to speak with you privately." They stood in the kitchen, and she told him what she had found, and she watched him understand it. He stood with his hands on the back of a chair, and his jaw set in that way he had when he was keeping himself still. "I don't have another option," he said. "You have one," she said. She told him about her father's estate. She told him slowly, in order, the way she had told it to no one since the county clerk's office. The hardware business, the accounts. Her Uncle Gerald's management of the estate, following her father's death. The documents she had eventually realized were forged, the county clerk, the fire. She told him about the papers she had taken from the house before it burned, because she had known, somewhere below conscious thought, that she should take them. She had been carrying them for 8 months. They were in her trunk, in the room off the kitchen, wrapped in oilcloth. Edmund was quiet for a moment after she finished. "How much?" he said. "Enough," she said. "But it's not in my hands right now. That's the problem." Her father had been careful in a way that Gerald Voss had not anticipated. He had established, through a lawyer in Denver named Samuel Abernethy, a trust that held the primary assets of the Voss estate, the business, the land it sat on, a secondary property in Laramie that Clara had not known about until she had read the trust documents in the firelight the night the house burned. Gerald's forgeries had been directed at accounts that sat outside the trust, liquid money he could move without leaving a clear trail. The trust itself had legal protections that required Clara's signature, and Clara's signature alone, to transfer any assets. Gerald Voss, apparently, had not wanted to kill her. He had simply wanted to make her disappear long enough to find another way to break the trust. She had not disappeared. She had gotten on a train to Laramie, and then a stage to Ridge Creek, and answered an ad for a housekeeper, because she needed to be somewhere Gerald was not looking while she figured out what to do. "Abernethy," Edmund said. "I know of him." "He's legitimate," she said. "I've corresponded with him. He's been holding the trust pending my instruction. He didn't know where I was. Does your uncle know?" "He knows I'm somewhere," she said. "He doesn't know where. He hired a man to find me 3 weeks after the fire. I lost him in Laramie." She paused. "I think he may have found me again." Edmund looked at her. "There was a man outside the post office last week," she said. "I've seen him twice. He's not from here." Edmund rode to Laramie 2 days later. He was gone for 4 days, and Clara ran the house and managed Nora and did not let herself think too carefully about what she would do if he came back and told her he wanted no part of it. She had told him more than she had told anyone. She had not entirely meant to. It had come out in the way things come out when you have been holding them long enough, and you find yourself, unexpectedly, in a room with someone who listens without interrupting. She taught Nora long division. She repaired a hinge on the barn door. She found a box of seed packets in the back of the kitchen cupboard. Someone's intention, never acted on, and she cleared a strip of ground along the south side of the house and turned the soil because it was late for planting, but not impossible, and because she needed something to do with her hands. When Edmund came back, he had Samuel Abernethy with him. Abernethy was a compact, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase that had been well used for a long time. He shook Clara's hand and asked if there was somewhere they could sit and work, and she brought him to the kitchen table, which had become, she realized, the place where things got done in this house. He had the trust documents. She had her copies. She had her father's letters. She had the deed records she had taken from the house. Between the three of them, over the course of a long evening, they built a case that was, Abernethy said, holding his glasses up to read something in the lamplight, about as clear as these things could be made. Gerald Voss had forged 2 documents. The forgeries were detectable by someone who knew what they were looking at, which Abernethy did. The liquid accounts had been largely transferred, and recovering them would be a long process. But the trust was intact. The Laramie property was intact. The business had been sold. Gerald had managed that in the first year, but the sale could be challenged, and Abernethy thought the challenge would succeed. Clara would not get everything back. She would get most of it. It was enough. Douglas Crane came back 10 days later. This time, Edmund met him at the door. He told Crane that he had retained legal counsel and would be responding to the consortium's original loan terms in writing, with a correction to the interest calculation that had been applied incorrectly from the second year of the loan. He told him the corrected principal, and he watched the calculation cross Crane's face, the careful smile going still for a fraction of a second. He told Crane that the loan would be repaid in full within 30 days, and that the consortium should expect the relevant documentation from his attorney shortly. Crane said that he was sure they could find an arrangement agreeable to all parties. Edmund thanked him for his time and closed the door. Gerald Voss arrived in Ridge Creek on a Thursday. He was not subtle about it. He took a room at the saloon, and he was in the hotel dining room that evening, and the following morning he was on the main street, and he was watching Edmund's house. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. She had known this moment was coming. She had thought, when she imagined it, that she would feel afraid. What she felt instead was something closer to a settled clarity, the way a room gets when you finally stop rearranging the furniture and let it be what it is. She put on her coat. Edmund was in the surgery room at the back of the house when she came to find him. He looked at her face and asked no questions. He put down what he was doing and followed her. They walked to the saloon together, which surprised Gerald Voss. She could see it from 40 feet away, the slight recalibration of his expression when he realized she was not alone. He was a large man, with her father's broad forehead and none of her father's steadiness, and he had the look of someone who had spent the last several months being confident about something that was now turning uncertain. "Clara," he said. "Good morning," she said. She handed him an envelope. Inside it was a copy of the trust document, a copy of Abernethy's filed brief, and a letter from the county sheriff's office in Cheyenne, which Abernethy had contacted on her behalf, notifying Gerald Voss that an inquiry had been opened into the document discrepancies in the Voss estate. Gerald looked at the papers. "You have nothing," he said. "Abernethy has everything," she said. "I don't need to have anything." The three of them stood on the main street of Ridge Creek in the October morning light. Somewhere behind them she could hear the feed barn open and the ordinary sounds of the town beginning its day. Gerald Voss looked at Edmund. "Who are you?" "Edmund Hale," he said. "I'm the doctor here. And what are you to her?" Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm working on that." Gerald left Ridge Creek the following day. The legal process was long, and the outcome was not certain in all of its particulars, but Abernethy proved correct about the fundamentals, and by the following spring, the trust had been formally confirmed, and the Laramie property established clearly in Clara's name. She did not leave Ridge Creek. This was not something she had decided all at once. She had told herself, through the autumn and into the winter, that she was staying because the legal matters required her proximity, because it was simpler to work with Abernethy from Ridge Creek than to establish herself elsewhere, because Nora had started leaving books on her pillow, and it would be unkind to disrupt that. She told herself these things in the same way she had once told herself she was simply reading a ledger because she'd found it by accident. Edmund said nothing for a long time. He was a man who used words carefully and sometimes too sparingly, and she had learned to read the space between what he said and what he meant. He asked her opinion on medical matters he could have decided alone. He showed her, once, a letter he had drafted, but not sent, came to find her in the garden on a Sunday afternoon and stood there for a while, and then he said, "I haven't been good company, I know that." "I haven't required it," she said, "I know." He looked at the turned earth of the garden. "Nora asked me if you were staying." Clara waited. "I told her I didn't know," he said. "She told me that was the wrong answer." A pause. "I thought she was probably right. They were married in March, in the church with the crooked steeple, with Abernethy standing as witness, and Nora in a new dress she had selected herself, and the Ketterley family in the third pew, because Edmund had attended the birth of 4 of their children, and they considered it a family event. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them had wanted large. What Clara remembered most clearly from that morning was not the ceremony but the walk from the house to the church, the ground still half frozen underfoot, Edmund walking beside her, not speaking, and the particular quality of the morning light on the limestone ridge above the town, cold and exact and very clear, the kind of light that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. She did not simply pay Edmund's loan and retire into the life of a doctor's wife. The Laramie property, once confirmed as hers, provided a rental income that was modest but steady. She used part of the first year's proceeds to settle Edmund's debt to the Laramie Lending Consortium in full. She paid the corrected principal, and she had Abernethy send the payment with a letter disputing the interest overcharge, which the consortium did not contest in writing, which she understood as their version of acknowledging what they had done. She kept the rest in an account under her own name, because she had not survived everything she had survived in order to give up being careful. In 1887, she used a portion of it to build a reading room adjacent to the church, which the town of Ridge Creek did not have. She filled it with books purchased through a supplier in Denver and cataloged them herself over the course of a winter, with Nora's increasingly expert assistance. Nora was 12 by then and had very strong opinions about how books should be organized, and Clara was practical enough to let her have them. The reading room was open to anyone who came. The wall beside the door had a small plaque that read, "In memory of Henry Voss, who kept honest accounts." Edmund outlived Clara by 4 years. He was 67 when she died, and she was 51, and the cause was not dramatic, a pneumonia that arrived in November and did not leave. She had been ill for 3 weeks, and in that time Edmund was at her side with the full attention of a man who had spent his professional life fighting this particular enemy and understood, with great precision, the morning it became clear he was going to lose. Nora came back from Laramie, where she had been teaching school for 3 years. She sat with her stepmother for the last 2 days and read to her from a book of her own choosing, and Clara, who was conscious through most of it, listened. What Edmund said at the funeral was brief. He was not a man who delivered speeches easily, and he did not try to. He said that Clara had come to his house as a stranger carrying a broken trunk and a ledger full of other people's mistakes, and that she had fixed the ledger and stayed, and that he had been every day since glad that she had. The reading room remained open. It remained open after Edmund died. Nora saw to it. After Nora, her son saw to it, and then the town library committee, which had been formally established by 1921, and which counted among its founding documents a deed of gift signed by Clara Hale née Voss in 1887. The plaque beside the door stayed. It was still there when the building was renovated in 1954, and the committee had it cleaned and remounted, and it remained exactly where Clara had put it, not in the center, not somewhere prominent, just beside the door where anyone coming in would see it on their way to the books, which was, the committee agreed, exactly where she would have wanted it to be.